Parts of Los Angeles are under another night of curfew restrictions as Mayor Karen Bass tries to clamp down on the vandalism and protests in the city. The Los Angeles Police Department reported 78 arrests overnight for charges including failure to disperse and curfew violations.
Did you know that the federal appeals court just handed President Trump a major victory, ruling he can keep control of the National Guard in Los Angeles? For weeks, tensions have been boiling between the Trump administration and California officials over who has the final say in deploying troops during civil unrest. So how are people reacting to this latest news? Let's find out. In a significant legal development, a federal appeals court ruled late Thursday that President Donald Trump can continue to deploy the National Guard in Los Angeles to address immigration-related protests, overturning a lower court's decision that had sought to return control of the troops to California Governor Gavin Newsom. The unanimous 38-page ruling by a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit found that President Trump acted within his authority when he federalized the state's National Guard, asserting that the situation in Los Angeles justified the move to ensure enforcement of federal immigration laws. The dispute arose after a federal judge in San Francisco ruled last week that the protests did not meet the threshold required for the president to invoke a rarely used law allowing federal takeover of the National Guard without the governor's consent. However, the appeals court, which included 2 Trump appointees and 1 Biden appointee, disagreed, emphasizing that the president's judgment in such matters should be given due deference. Affording appropriate deference to the president's determination, we conclude that he likely acted within his authority in federalizing the National Guard, the court stated in its unsigned opinion. The ruling was widely anticipated as the judges had signaled during Tuesday's hearing that they were inclined to allow Trump to maintain control of the Guard while legal challenges proceed. However, the decision also introduced uncertainty over the next phase of the case. U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer, who was scheduled to hear arguments Friday on California's request to limit how the administration uses the 4,000 National Guard troops and 700 active-duty Marines deployed in Los Angeles, postponed the hearing. Judge Breyer expressed doubts over whether he still had jurisdiction in the matter, given the appeals court's intervention, and requested further legal briefs from both sides by Monday to clarify the issue.
And good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Dan Ashley. That breaking news is an appeals court decision allowing President Trump to remain in command of the National Guard troops in Los Angeles. You may recall last week a judge ruled the deployment was illegal and control was supposed to go back to the governor on Friday. But an appeals court stopped that order until a hearing this past Tuesday. In its ruling tonight, the judges disagreed with the state, saying the chaos on the streets of Los Angeles warrants the deployment of the Guard by the president. This case is expected to make it to the Supreme Court. What happened in L.A. was the first time the National Guard was deployed without a governor's permission since 1965.
The case highlights the ongoing tension between federal and state authorities over immigration enforcement and the use of military resources in domestic disputes. In the wake of a federal appeals court ruling that upheld President Donald Trump's authority to deploy the National Guard in Los Angeles amid immigration protests, both sides intensified their legal and political arguments. Trump celebrated the decision in a social media post, framing it as validation for his broader stance on using federal troops when local enforcement falters. "The court got it right," he wrote, suggesting that similar actions could be taken all over the United States, if necessary. California Governor Gavin Newsom, however, struck a defiant tone, seizing on the court's rejection of the Trump administration's most sweeping claim that a president's decision to federalize the National Guard is entirely beyond judicial review. "The president is not a king and is not above the law," Newsom said in a sharply worded statement. He vowed to continue challenging what he called Trump's authoritarian use of military forces against American citizens, signaling that the legal battle is far from over. The appeals court's ruling was a nuanced one. While it deferred to Trump's judgment that the protests had disrupted federal immigration enforcement, justifying his invocation of an obscure statute allowing federal control of state guard units, it firmly rejected the administration's argument that such decisions should be immune from judicial scrutiny. The judges noted that Supreme Court precedent does not give the president unchecked power to deploy troops without evidence or in bad faith. Still, they found that the violence in Los Angeles, which had at times obstructed immigration authorities, provided enough justification for Trump's move.
An appeals court says the president can keep control of California's National Guard. The three-judge panel ruled yesterday the violence at protests in Los Angeles have given him a legal reason to seize control of the state military.
Another key dispute centered on procedural details. California had argued that the mobilization order was invalid because Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth bypassed Governor Newsom by sending the directive directly to a National Guard general. But the court dismissed this claim, ruling that since the general ultimately answered to Newsom, the chain of command was effectively preserved. Even if there had been a technical violation, the judges added, it wouldn't have warranted stripping Trump of control over the Guard entirely. The focus now shifts back to U.S. District Judge Charles Breyer, who must decide whether he still has jurisdiction to impose restrictions on how the federal government uses the troops. California is pushing for limits that would confine their role to protecting federal buildings and bar them from assisting ICE agents in workplace raids, the very operations that ignited the protests. At the heart of this request is the Posse Comitatus Act, a Reconstruction-era law that restricts military involvement in domestic policing. The Trump administration insists it is not violating the act, arguing that troops are merely providing support, not directly enforcing laws. Meanwhile, tensions flared further when Secretary Hegseth hinted at defiance, telling the Senate Armed Services Committee that district courts should not dictate national security policy. His remarks raised questions about how the administration would respond if Judge Breyer rules against it. As the legal drama unfolds, the situation on the ground in Los Angeles has stabilized. Mayor Karen Bass lifted a downtown curfew this week, declaring that local authorities had restored order. But the broader conflict over federal power, states' rights, and military deployment in domestic disputes remains unresolved, setting the stage for more high-stakes legal and political clashes in the weeks ahead. The ongoing dispute between California officials and the Trump administration over the deployment of National Guard troops took another turn this week, with state leaders maintaining their position that local law enforcement was fully capable of handling immigration protests without federal military intervention. From the outset, Governor Gavin Newsom and other California officials have argued that President Trump's decision to federalize the National Guard only escalated tensions rather than restoring order. This was an unnecessary overreach that undermined local authority and exacerbated the situation, a senior state official said, speaking on condition of anonymity. Yet President Trump struck a defiant tone during remarks to reporters outside the White House on Wednesday, framing the operation as an unqualified success and signaling his willingness to deploy troops to other cities if similar protests emerge. "We did a great job. We quelled that thing," the president said, referring to the demonstrations in Los Angeles. He suggested that the mere threat of federal intervention had a deterrent effect, adding, "The fact that we are even there thinking about going in, they won't bother with it anymore. They'll go someplace else. But we'll be there too. We'll be wherever they go." The president's comments underscore a broader tension between his administration's approach to civil unrest and the preferences of state and local leaders, particularly in Democratic strongholds like California. While Trump has repeatedly emphasized a law and order message, framing federal troop deployments as a necessary tool to combat chaos, critics argue that such moves risk militarizing domestic disputes and infringing on states' rights. Legal scholars note that the Insurrection Act, which the administration has cited as justification, is typically reserved for extreme scenarios where local authorities are unable or unwilling to maintain public safety, a standard California insists was never met in this case. The situation remains fluid as legal challenges work their way through the courts. Should the administration follow through on the president's suggestion to deploy troops more widely, it could trigger a wave of new lawsuits from states opposing federal overreach. For now, the standoff in California serves as a microcosm of the larger national debate over the balance of power between Washington and state governments, a debate that shows no signs of cooling as the election approaches. With both sides digging in, the coming weeks could see further clashes over the limits of presidential authority and domestic military deployments. Will this ruling open the floodgates for more federal troop deployments in Democratic-led cities? Or will states push back even harder, setting the stage for a historic constitutional clash? Let us know in the comments what you think of the whole situation, and if you want to stay on top of this, smash that like and subscribe button.